So if you'll be turning your Bibles to 1 Samuel 21, that's where most of our context is going to be. We closed out the last lesson discussing Jonathan. It's after the point that Jonathan gives David the signal that he needs to hightail it out of town because things still aren't good with Saul. So David makes a journey that, from my findings, was probably somewhere between 2 to maybe 5 miles max. Not a super far journey to Nob. What is special about Nob?
That's where David and his men ate the showbread.
Okay, so that's exactly where we're heading into. So what else? So Miss Carroll says this is where David and his men ate the showbread. What else is unique about Nob?
It must have been where the tabernacle was.
Okay, so where the tabernacle was, we see that David runs into this priest named Ahimelech. And if you read through this, what did David tell the priest?
Well, he was unprepared for provisions and weapons, and he told the priest that he had to leave quickly on a mission for the king.
Okay, so Miss Carroll said that David is telling Ahimelech, hey, I'm on this expedition for the king. I had to leave in such a hurry that I didn't even have time to, basically I don't have food, I don't have weapons. What can you provide me with? So it's at this point, and I think it's from what I started to find a very debated point of David eating this showbread. Now, what would be wrong with David eating the showbread?
He wasn't a priest.
Wasn't a priest. Okay.
Wrong tribe, I guess.
I'm sorry?
You'd be with the wrong tribe. He wasn't a priest.
Wrong tribe. Okay. So there's some questions surrounding, when we start looking at how David's described oftentimes in the Bible, even through, we say, well, he's got a heart after God's own heart. And then we start seeing he's doing these things that don't make a lot of sense when we know it's not right. And we're going to see more of this as we talk about King Achish and some of the things that David does. But in this moment, it's not, we often call these things white lies, right? It's just downright misleading Ahimelech, this priest, to get this food. And then, of course, he asked for a weapon, which interestingly, what weapon just happened to be laying around there? Goliath's sword. Well, I don't know how much. I've got this big sword over here. How about, well, there's no sword like it, so I'll take that one. Sounds good. Kind of an interesting interaction here between David and Ahimelech. And it's after this point, we get to verse 10 of chapter 21. David arose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. Now, what's unique about this journey? Is there anything that stands out to you of, first of all, who is Achish, the king of Gath? What would that be to David? Enemy, right? They're enemies of the Israelites. So if you were to look on this, or to look at this on a map from Nob to Gath, I think is approximately about 30-mile journey east, right, John? East of Nob?
East, southwest.
Southwest, I'm sorry, southwest. Oh, yeah. Southwest, okay. So southwest to Gath, approximately 30 miles. Don't hold me to that. That's just from what I could find. So that's a bit of a journey into enemy territory. It gets here, and what happens when David arrives here?
Some of the men recognized him.
Yeah.
Okay.
Soldiers, yeah.
How in the world will they recognize David?
The lady singing.
He only killed our giant. I think we might have an idea of who this guy is. So David panics in this, I think, in a way, in this moment. It says in 12, David took these words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. This is after the servant said to Achish, "Is not this David the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another, Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000?" So they know some of David's story, don't they? These stories have traveled all the way there. They've got an idea of who he is. I'm pretty sure they know what he looks like. So because they're obviously saying, "Is this not David?" So David, I think, panics in this moment. And how does he change his demeanor?
Acts as if he's mad.
Okay, says he's mad, acts like a madman, starts acting crazy, foaming at the mouth, or it says let his spittle run down his beard. And how does Achish respond to that?
He doesn't want him around him.
Yeah, why would I want this crazy man around me? So, as we kind of read through this and think about these things, I was wondering, I wonder if Achish actually knew what David looked like, and if he did know what David looked like, is it just that David did such a good job playing Mr. Madman that it was enough for him to just pretty much pay no attention? You're calling this guy a hero. I'm not even looking at him. Look, he's crazy. I can hear that. So David must have done a pretty good job. Must have been a pretty good actor or something. So Achish says, I don't want this guy around me. And the whole lesson kind of tries to look at Achish's view of David in this point in 1 Samuel 21. And that's fine, and we're definitely going to discuss some of these things. But I would like to do is actually discuss a series of things. And we're going to look at not only 1 Samuel 21, but we're going to look at Samuel chapter 27 as well. Because we're going to see some things in chapter 27 about King Achish, and I've got some entertaining questions for you to consider about that in a different scene with David and King Achish. So I do want to look at both of these, but by all means, we'll discuss and entertain the questions that the writer gave us here. So before I jump into that, I kind of got ahead of myself with a question that I had earlier. I want to back up. I want to back up to the Ahimelech scene for just a moment, because all these things point to things that other people are seeing about David, views of David through others' eyes. And I had a question. When David eats the showbread, first of all, we kind of said, how and why was he able to do that? That would be my question to you guys. Some of the things that I saw started to entertain things like, since it was older showbread, it was going to be tossed out anyway. Maybe there was this underlying rule that they could give it to those who were starving. Or maybe it's that starvation superseded the law, or it was the classic doing the good thing or doing a bad thing for the good reason or for the better reason. What are some of your guys' thoughts on why that would have been allowed?
Luke, let me ask you a question. Was this the bread that had been taken down and would be eaten by the priest? It wasn't the holy bread, the fresh bread that was offered to.
I think it was the old bread
The
removed.
old bread.
They were getting ready to replace it with the new hot bread, yes. So that is one positive note, we'll say.
But
So
it was an offering to God that would be eaten by the priest.
Right.
So I mean, I think that Ahimelech here makes an exception. And it seems as though Jesus later refers to this event, almost justifying what was done here. And I don't understand that, but there's several cases where David's going to break Old Testament law very clearly. Him wearing the ephod in one case, him eating the showbread in this case.
Yeah.
refers to this event and seems to justify what David did or what Ahimelech did. I don't really have an explanation for that.
So I had that note written down as well. For those of you who didn't hear, this is referenced by Jesus. One of the references is Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. He references this, to the Pharisees who are accusing his disciples of doing something they shouldn't have been doing on the Sabbath day. I did find a note that was interesting. I wrote it, copied and pasted it. One person said that Jesus' main point seems to be that the Pharisees are being hypocritical nitpickers. What David did was not lawful, yet they saw David as a great hero. What Jesus' disciples did was lawful, since they were not truly harvesting grain, but simply plucking some grains to munch on as they walked along. The Pharisees did not condemn David for actually breaking the law, but they were willing to condemn Jesus for doing something that was actually allowable. And I thought that was an interesting note. That was kind of a comparison. Well, in that moment, for Jesus basically saying, "You bunch of nitpickers, or you hypocrites, you don't even know, you don't understand the law, obviously." So that was one point that I found. I thought that was interesting, but it is referenced. Like I said, this same scene is referenced by Jesus in those three. I think actually what John said, the three accounts. I didn't have all those written down, but so we do have that reference, and Jesus. It is kind of seen by some people that, well, Jesus is justifying what David did in that moment. Maybe that's the case. Maybe he's just using it as a comparison. Any other thoughts on why this would be allowable?
You have to remember that several times in the prophets of the Old Testament statement is made about God that he desires something rather than something else. Mercy over sacrifice. Doesn't mean he doesn't authorize sacrifice. But what's greater in God's eyes?
Okay.
Ahimelech, was he being merciful or greedy? Why did he offer this to David? You recall also, same thing that was brought up, whoever was, I couldn't tell who was speaking. The scribes and Pharisees that confronted Jesus and condemned him. I think John was talking about that. Another instance, they did the same thing about Jesus breaking the Sabbath by working. And he said, which of you on the Sabbath day would not do a merciful act? You do it. Am I being merciful? So I think this principle of mercy, I desire mercy over sacrifice. We need to do some studying and see if that doesn't help to explain these events.
Okay, good. So the concept of mercy over sacrifice there is what Roger was talking about. So I bring this up not to poke at necessarily just this showbread scene, but we've got to also remember there's other people seeing and experiencing David in moments. What are they seeing? What are they experiencing? What might they be learning and gathering from this? And for us, as we read this outside looking in, I think it might be easy for us to say, "Holy cow, David's just lying to a priest here." I mean, what is he thinking? And how could God approve of such a thing? We know this is wrong. So it's interesting to think about. Kyle?
Yeah, in Mark's account of that, Jesus really doesn't mince words. He says what David did was not lawful. It was not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And what you just brought up, David did a lot of things that weren't lawful in this account. There were several things that go on. But to the point that was made, Jesus is doing something that is lawful. He's bringing this up to show that if David is going to be viewed as such a hero, even when he has these very questionable things that take place in his eyes, than how you see Jesus. But I think there's a greater picture is comparing Jesus to Ahimelech. one, Ahimelech is really worried about this whole situation. He has all these questions. He doesn't just see, oh, here's a guy in need, here, take this. He has a great view of God's holiness. And so, one, as Ms. Carroll pointed out, this is not God's portion. We're not taking something devoted to God. We're taking something that has been given and appointed to the priests. And even then, I've got some questions. I want to know, I want to make sure that what I'm doing with this doesn't fly entirely in the face of what God has talked, given us, has commanded us. So I do think there is a sense where we focus a lot on David in this account. I know the class is about David, and so we should. But Ahimelech is kind of a picture of a priest that is giving to someone something that they don't deserve, that is reserved for those holy to God. I think there's a great picture there of Jesus as well, the great high priest who does the same thing for us.
Good.
Not to beat up David, but just to echo what's been said. The reason why he's a man after God's own heart is because he's a messed up guy. We are. And has the ability to be right in God's eyes. That's why he's such an appealing character for us. But we can just go chapter by chapter and note his sins. And I don't think Jesus gives him a pass here. But of course he blatantly breaks the Levitical law, wearing the ephod, dancing naked in the streets. He's going to blatantly lie to Achish and basically put on an Oscar-worthy performance. I mean, he messes up over Bathsheba and counting of the people of Israel, and all this over and over again. But that's why we can look to him and have hope.
Yeah.
We don't have to do this.
Yeah, and the comparison is the heart. The heart after God's own heart. So when we look at David, we're not just looking at necessarily these deeds, but how does he respond? How does he act after he's gone through these things?
And, to John's point, not to beat up David, Doeg is here
Yes.
when this happens.
Yes.
David has reason. It's not that, again, this doesn't give him a pass. It's very similar to Abraham. He has reason to be afraid. And that fear prompts him to act in ways that aren't worthy of emulation. But his response later to those shortcomings certainly is worthy.
Yeah.
It's the penitent heart that he has.
All right, so here's what we're going to do from here.
Hey, Luke.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
One more thought. When David's in front of Goliath of Gath, he says, "You come to me with a sword and a spear, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts." And when he's before Achish of Gath, he says, "I'm afraid I'm going to act like a crazy person." That's a very different response.
Oh, yeah.
And so, I'm somewhat echoing what these guys have already said, but there's some ebb in David's faith here. His fear affected his faith.
Yeah.
There's no mention of God in these, David doesn't mention God in any of these passages.
Right.
Like what happened with his wife and what happened with Jonathan has affected him.
Yeah.
I think maybe that's the story.
Yeah, so we're going to see more of this. And it's not that David didn't have God in his heart necessarily, because we're gonna find a psalm written by David around this time frame, and we're going to see some very outpouring thoughts toward godliness. But it's interesting that he's not living what he's writing. So yeah, we're going to see that. I'm going to move into the questions, just because they really kind of relate to this context, this immediate context. And then we're going to talk about chapter 27, I think, is how I'm going to roll out here. So, well, here it is. I didn't know it was the first one. It says, read Psalm 34, and how would you describe David's mindset as he writes the psalm based on certain verses here? According to the heading of Psalm 34, when does David write this psalm? And please note that Abimelech was often a title used for Philistine kings, just like Pharaoh was a title used for Egyptian kings. Now, If you have these little headers over the chapters in your Psalms, mine reads of David when he changed his behavior before Abimelech so that he drove him out and he went away. So, time and place, I think, is pretty close to right here, where we're at in Samuel 21. So let's look at some of the words he's using. Verse 4 and verse 6, Michael.
I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from all my fears. Verse 6, a poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of his trouble.
Okay, 18 and 19, Bridgman, please.
The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all.
Okay. Let's talk about the mindset of David right here. What's the mindset?
Repentant.
Did you say repentant? Okay.
I think he's really, at least in this Psalm 34, he's focused on God's ability to save or to deliver.
Okay.
Grateful.
Grateful? Okay. Rodman?
I think touching upon what Michael said a minute ago, this psalm mentions here, David is at this point in his life, he is brokenhearted. What has happened up, as Michael said, leading up to this.
Yep.
But his mindset, he's brokenhearted. I mean, how many of us haven't been there?
Roger hits on a point that is pretty much written out on page 15 if you have in your books. It's literally kind of a walkthrough of what David has experienced up to this point. So, yes, we are hitting hard on some of the things David done, but at the same time, like Roger's saying, think about what he's been through. So there's a lot to consider here. So this heavy-heartedness tying into his faith in the Lord, this is his outpouring psalm to God, acknowledging that, look, I know God delivers. But is he exemplifying that in his actions? Is he showing that in his actions here with Abimelech or Achish? Sorry, I guess same difference.
He did. I don't think he did. I think maybe writing the psalm in retrospect, he recognized that God was there.
Yes.
In the moment, it doesn't look like that's what was on his mind.
Yeah. Sorry, I probably didn't phrase that right.
Sorry, I didn't mean to stiff impress me.
He was desperate also. I mean, he lost his friend. The king had turned on him. They were hungry, he and his soldiers. He was desperate.
Mm-hmm.
And he says in verse 6 that he was a lonely man and he called upon the Lord.
Yes. So Michael
God
said that.
helped him. God helped him.
Yeah. The word in retrospect, right? So I've gone through these things. I made some really bad decisions, and I'm gonna share with you what I learned in a very difficult way, right? It's Roger?
You mentioned earlier that chapter 27, he's going to again be in the presence of the Philistine. Psalm 56 also might be applying to this, or chapter 27, because the heading in Psalm 56 says, a song of David when the Philistines took him in Gath. If you read that psalm, it fits his mindset here, but it could be in the later time that he is 600 men.
Okay.
He says, if I stay here, it's just a matter of time till Saul kills me.
Mm-hmm.
I'll flee. So he goes back to Gath again. So whether Psalm 56 is his second trip or into, but if you read these 13 verses, it fits the mindset of a broken-hearted man that, my enemies, there's just no let up. I'm haunted, I'm hunted, I'm pursued. It's just constant pressure. Fits as Carol was, this is a broken-hearted mindset. So
You
it's
think,
something to look at.
yeah, you think about, I think if we're being honest, at least for the most part, I think I would argue that we're in our deepest and hardest reaching out to God when we're in our most struggling moments, and or moments that we've had realization from something that we experienced that we didn't, hey, this didn't go right, or this was really, really bad, and I'm in a really bad spot because of this, and I should have trusted you more, and I do believe in you. I just wish I'd done that, and so there's a lot of things we can relate to, I think, as we look at these situations versus the learning, both for us, for him, and then his encouragement moving forward. And I think that's how we learn from the wisdom and experience of our elders as well. People who have lived through situations that they can come back and say, hey, this is probably the wiser thing to do. I've been through that, or I've experienced that. Kyle?
I know a later question kind of a little bit digs into 1 Peter, but Peter's letters are kind of written in that vein. I've been through a difficult time, and I made a lot of mistakes along my path. Don't make the same mistakes that I made. And when you think back over Peter's life, there is a great similarity to some of the points that we brought up here about David. He's one of the ones that has that very outspoken and bold statement, but also after confessing Christ, he's going to turn around and show that he doesn't, he still is adamant on his way. He thinks this is how things should go. And when push comes to shove, he lets fear control him as well. And puts on a show. I mean, he's cursing and trying to make himself look like something very different than what he is. And he'll turn around and similarly say, it can be hard, but don't follow the path that I followed in.
Yeah.
Don't make these mistakes. Learn from my mistakes.
Do as I say, not as I did, man.
Look at it, as we're looking through the eyes of people who are seeing David. When you see Ahimelech tremble when he lays eyes on David, it's interesting. What did he look like? Was he disheveled and what was his physical appearance? And what has happened to this guy who everybody kind of knows? How did he get to this point? So,
Yep. Good stuff. Thank you. All right, so then the book goes on to number 2, where it says, now read 1 Samuel 21. What new situation does David find himself in as we come to this chapter, and in what way does he handle this new lifestyle poorly? We've already discussed it. So that he's come to Achish, now he's in fear, he's acting like a madman. It's a bit obvious that it doesn't seem like he's really putting this all into God's hands. He's trying to find a way out of it, right? He's in panic mode, a lot of emotional distress, a lot going on here. So, hey, I'll act crazy and get out of this situation. Does Achish, number 3, does Achish, the king of Gath, seem to think David is acting very courageous and kingly? I think the answer is obvious. This is no king. This is somebody who's lost their mind. Back to Roger's point, number 4. Now let's seek to understand with a touch of mercy all David has been through up to this point. How can knowing one's past circumstances help us relate to them in the present? How can knowing one's past circumstances help us relate to them in the present? Thoughts?
Well, he's been hunted like a dog by Saul for no apparent reason, and it's caused a lot of this hardship that's come upon him. And when you kind of look at that, you can understand a little bit why David's acting the way he is. Doesn't justify it. One thing you can't justify, but you can, he's being hunted like a dog for no apparent reason.
Okay.
It helps you to be more compassionate and patient with them once you understand what they have went through and how they got to where they are.
I'm so happy that you said that, Roger. I literally wrote, knowing struggles or pressures can help us be more patient and forbearing.
It's a hard lesson to learn.
The counter thought to that for me, this is 11 o'clock at night, take this with a grain of salt. Shouldn't we always be patient? Whether we know the full history or not, shouldn't we all be patient? So I say that from this perspective, and I hope I say this correctly. I think we can get into situations where you meet someone and maybe they say, I grew up in the church. Okay, vague statement. I grew up in the church. Now, we don't know what kind of church necessarily. They're just saying the church. So we start talking to them about things and we realize they're not on the same page as me. If you grew up in the church, you should be on the same page as me. Now, I know in history, I've gotten a little bit more defensive more quickly in those situations. Well, if you grew up in the church, you probably read this verse. You should know that this verse applies here, and this is how it applies. I mean, good grief, what are you smoking? But if someone says, I didn't grow up in the church at all, I never went to a church, and you start talking to them, and you understand, oh, well, you never saw this verse. You can't possibly know that this applies in this situation. Have we given grace in both situations? Have we given mercy and patience in both situations? The answer is no. At least in my case, many times I've been in that situation, but I appreciate Roger saying that because it's still true. Knowing what they've been through helps us know how to respond and how to treat, but we should still always be patient and merciful and kind and forbearing as best we can, right? Are we now being patient, merciful, and kind toward David with all this in mind? Does it change your perspective when you think about that? Okay, I can kind of understand why he may be doing some of these things. Would I have handled it the same way? I don't know. This has nothing to do with the lesson, but I laugh so hard. Well, y'all know him, Landon Rudder, is not a gun owner. He doesn't like guns. I'm a gun owner. And many years ago, we had this discussion. I said, well, what are you going to do if someone breaks in your house? He said, I'm going to get up out of bed, scream my head off, run around like a crazy man until they get out of the house. I was like, I hope that works for you, buddy. But I could see him doing it. It's a funny thing, but maybe that's just what works to get out of the situation. Use David's story for your success. But again, this does, I think, put it in perspective for us to consider or reconsider. Okay, he's done some really stupid, bad things. We know that because we understand it was wrong or right. But I understand he's in a tough situation, and I wasn't in that situation. I don't know how I would have responded.
Luke, I thought it was very interesting. One of the commentaries I read said that David knew how to act like a madman because he had observed Saul in the dark side, and he's playing the harp to help him get out of it.
Yeah.
So he
had some ideas of what that might look like?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it makes you wonder what the Philistine men were like when King Achish said, do I lack madmen?
Yeah.
At my disposal, I don't even know.
I already hang out with you guys enough. I don't need another one.
Luke, I think something that's important that we need before the class is overtaken with all this. When you read chapter 21, you kind of get the picture, or I do, that David is fearful, faithless, all those things associated with that. When you read what he penned in the Psalms, I see, man, this is how he coped with all his fears. He prayed to God.
Yeah.
We have his prayers.
Yeah.
And this is not, he prayed a couple of times. You look at the Psalms, this is how David coped with the constant pressure, threats, all of his own failings.
Mm-hmm.
He took it to the Lord in prayer. And I think that's the greatest lesson we should take from this particular lesson. David coped with everything by turning to God. How could a man faithless and fearless, or fearful, pen such beautiful words as chapter 34?
Yeah.
He never lost sight of the fact, my only source of help is Jehovah.
Yeah.
And I think that should help us and encourage us to take our failures and our fears to the Lord.
Yeah.
Continually and fervently, and we'll get relief.
Great stuff. So if y'all didn't hear that in the back, Roger's point in summary was this is how David coped with his fears, with his failures, was through prayer, through relying on God. So, yes, great stuff.
And Luke, he was quite David was quite successful as a warrior and all, and I've not seen pride enter into him. He's not prideful, to my knowledge.
Okay,
The
Kyle?
last time. Do you see David ever being prideful and taking
In these accounts here,
any,
you know, there's some places where where his ego gets the best of him. Specifically, I think of Bathsheba,
Oh,
and
okay.
his view that this is all mine. It's mine for the taking, or I might deserve this. Certainly not here. He seems to be brought very low. But it stands out to me in this passage that the king of Gath recognizes David as royalty, even though Saul is still king in the land, and David still speaks of Saul. We have that account of David, saying, "How can I do anything against God's anointed?" So he has that understanding. But what is it? It's just interesting to me that the king of Gath sees David and recognizes him as a king. Isn't this king of the land? That would have to imply something about the anointing of David by Samuel. Something has gotten out to spread the word that David is now recognized as the new king. And it's just a strange thing to me that he sees that, and the depiction that he gets of this is who is king over these people who follow the God Yahweh, he's crazy. When we think about that in our lives, one, what are we depicting to the world around us? They see us, and they may not know to the fullest extent, but this is somebody that belongs to God, or at least claims they belong to God. How do we act to show them that? But also, how many times do people look at us and think, well, they're crazy because of the things that they do? And I'm not sure that, it was a point of comfort. It shouldn't be a point of comfort. And it was certainly something that was brought upon by his actions that aren't to be highlighted. But even in our actions of following God, we're going to face our own Achishes in the world that look at us and go, "You're a madman. You believe this man was raised from the dead. You don't do these things. You're crazy."
So I didn't know how to take, and I may be tying in chapter 27 too hard with this, but verse 11 says, "And the servants of Achish said, 'Is not this David the king of the land?'" I just wondered if King Achish was truly paying attention to who this was, or truly recognized him at this point. I didn't see that yet, but maybe that is there. I'm not saying it's not there. And the only reason I say that, again, is because of what we see in chapter 27. Wow. Since I said that, let's just look at chapter 27 real quick. I'm going to skip several sections of my notes. I really want to talk about the cave of Adullam here, but maybe we'll come back to that. What happens in chapter 27? David has made his way back to Gath. And let's see. So he's fearing for his life. Verse 2, "So David arose and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish the son of Maoch, king of Gath. And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household. And David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. And when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. Then David said to Achish, 'If I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be given me in one of your country towns, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you?'" And we'll stop there. Same Achish or different Achish? Is this a son of the prior king? Do we know? I couldn't find enough information on that to really pin it down. But my question is, how did he go from acting like a madman in front of the king to coming back and being like, "If I found favor in your sight"?
Well, David comes back with a formidable force that's clearly in conflict with his enemy.
Mm-hmm.
So he takes a calculated risk And he takes a calculated risk, I think, seeing more of the upside than the downside, in that this is the enemy of my enemy, and so it's worth the risk. But what he didn't, assess wisely was David's cunning. I mean, David was going to basically flat out deceive him into thinking that he's doing good for the Philistines, when in fact he's doing bad.
Right.
And so I think these lapses, I think both the times that David goes to Achish were lapses in faith. And they demonstrate his roller coaster like faith, which is like ours. And then he goes from highs to lows. He goes from, moments of highs with Goliath to moments of despair, literally groveling to the nation's enemies. So but he was deceptive. I think that he's willing to take a calculated risk and put them in their own little town where they can kind of be a little bit of a distance from Gath.
Yeah. So if you haven't read this, or if you can't remember, chapter 27, to touch on what John was saying there, I mean, the entire time, this year and 4 months span that David was here, he was deceiving the king. But he deceived him so well that he became his personal bodyguard. He got positioned so well in that deceit that he became Achish's personal bodyguard. I just kind of found it interesting to entertain the thought, what was going through his head when David came. But John does point out, well, now he comes with a formidable force. I mean, he's got this great amount of people with him that came from, I forget how to say it, the cave of Adullam. Yeah, from all over Israel. And this is not just the 600 men. I mean, this would be potentially thousands. So pretty intimidating force. So John's point is maybe this is a calculated risk. Hey, I thought you were crazy. I guess I was wrong. You look like you're leading a pretty powerful crew here. Okay, I'll give you a spot over here. Out of sight, out of mind. And I'm going to ask for a report every once in a while, and you're going to give me a report of who you've raided. And when David told him who he raided, what did he do? Told him that I took care of, these were your enemies, by the way, that I took care of. Was it in reality? No. This is why David left no one alive when he raided. He left no one alive in these places so that they couldn't come back and tell the king what actually was going on. So all the while, this entire year and 4 months, David is living a lie to this king. So we have two instances of David putting on, again, what John called an Oscar nominee reward here. Acting as someone who he's not spiritually, I guess, who he is. So just some really interesting things to consider. I had so many notes on Adullam that were kind of cool. But anyway, so interesting perspective to think about the Achish of Gath's view of David, but also great comments and conversation around what David had been through, thinking about his emotional and spiritual status, and then, trying to learn something with a grain of salt here. So thank you all for your comments. Appreciate it. And we will move on to the next lesson. What is that? Cush, Doeg, and the Ziphites' view of David.